Dr. Tillich, you left Germany in 1933 to come to this country. Would you care to comment on why you came to the United States?
Yes, I would like very much. It was even before Hitler came to power that I was opposed to the Nazi movement. I was at that time at the University of Frankfurt am Main as professor of philosophy, and the Nazis had organized Nazi student groups, and one day they entered the University of Frankfurt and beat up all the liberal students. And I was in the midst of it. And then we had a trial and threw these students out of the university, and I was, of course, active in this trial, and so I produced the wrath of the Nazi movements against me. And there were many other reasons, my whole political attitude. In any case, when Hitler came to power, I was a few weeks later dismissed from my position in the University of Frankfurt. And the same summer, a few months later, Reinhold Niebuhr came to Germany and asked me to come, after I had been dismissed, to Union Theological Seminary. And then I had a very dramatic talk with the Secretary of Education of Prussia, who was my highest boss, in which I told him my position very frankly about the persecution of the Jews and my affirmation of the Old Testament, Christianity generally. And then it was clear that I couldn't stay any longer in Germany, and so I decided to follow Niebuhr's invitation.
Dr. Tillich, in every man's case, I suppose, there's a close connection generally between the things which have happened to him in his own life and experience and the development of his thought. Would you tell us a little bit more about the other turning points in your biography which have been influential in the development of your thought?
Yes, I can tell you of one very dramatic moment. I was a chaplain in the First World War, and it was in the Battle of the Champagne in France. And it was one night in which many of my friends were fatally injured in a terrible battle, and I had to talk to them, and they died all around me. And in this night, something happened to my thought. Up to this time, I was a good German idealist of the type of Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. And in this night, my idealistic philosophy broke down forever. And this was one of the most important moments in my development. Ever since, I would call my own theological thinking, my philosophical thinking, a kind of critical realism, but certainly not idealism anymore. I have seen the deepest negative side of life in this night, and my eyes were open forever to see this side also.
Have there been any events that have taken place since you've been in this country that you feel have had a particular bearing upon shifts in your thinking?
Perhaps I could say that Corsi coming itself in the beginning
yes,
was another turning point. I still was bound by many elements of my past to the kind of thinking which was traditional in Germany, which was much more theoretical, speculative, philosophical. I came to this country and I noticed that here the practical problems were much more in the foreground than the merely metaphysical problems. And this was a great experience, which of course was not easy to digest. It took me many years before it influenced me deeper, but it did. And so my theology, especially my preaching, is now much more directed to the realities of the daily life than it was in Germany.
I know you have commented in the past on the transition which you made from the German language to the English language. I wonder how much effect this has had basically upon your thinking and your writing. Were you not 48 years old before you started speaking?
47.
47.
I learned English.
Yes.
Yes.
And yet it has been the major vehicle of your writing.
Yes, of course. I decided in the moment in which I put my foot on this continent that now I never will write anything in German, because translating things is a terrible job. It's much better to write a bad English lecture and then to have it English by students than to write it in German and then to have it translated. And this self-discipline, never writing again in German, was the basis for my limited ability to use the English language. But there was something else. The English language and the German language have a quite different type. The German language is full of nouns, and you can put half a dozen nouns together and make a new word out of it, which of course doesn't help to the clarity of your thinking. And so I wrote very difficult sentences in my later German writings, sometimes so difficult that when it came later on to translating them into English, I myself didn't understand them anymore. But the English language is a language of words mostly, and this makes it for much more clarity and logical consistency than German. And so I learned to think through the help of this new instrument, the English language. And when, after the war, 48, I came back to Germany the first time and gave a lecture in German, all my former pupils and friends were very much surprised that they could easily understand me. There were even some German colleagues who said he has become much shallower than he was. But this meant now they could understand. And that means in Germany, you are shallow. So the English language did me awfully good, and I am eternally grateful that it forced me into a new kind of thinking.
Yeah. You don't agree altogether then, Dr. Tillich, with the what seems to be so often the attitude of those who come from elsewhere to America, that this rather common sense character of much of our thinking and our attitudes is necessarily shallow.
No, by no means. I think the greatest things in world history have been said in the simplest way. For instance, the gospel stories and things like that. Yeah. And my whole desire was to reach more of this noble simplicity.
There was another question that occurred to my mind as we were talking about your being impressed with the attempt in America to make religious faith relevant to contemporary life, let's say, in society. While you were in Germany, you were active, were you not, in the religious socialist movement?
Yes.
Which meant that even there, before you came here, you were very much concerned about the social implications of religion. Could you say what was the difference between the social concern that you had before coming here and the change in your thinking in this regard after you came here?
No, I think the change was in the beginning not so very great, because I came here from the very beginning into the Christian socialist movement under the direction of Reinhold Niebuhr, who also had called me from Germany to come to Union Seminary. And we always worked together in this movement. The difference was that in Germany, as in most European countries, there is a large social democratic party. It's a political idea. In this country, there was only a negligible movement of this type, and it has in the meantime completely disappeared. This was one difference. And another difference was that in Germany, our movement called itself religious socialist, which meant that we included also Jews and all kinds of non-Christians, while in this country it was called Christian socialism, and it was even a kind of Christian brotherhood here, which was something quite new, which I never had in Germany in this way. And the reason was, the consequence was that the membership of this movement consisted mostly of Christians and very few non-Christians.
Dr. Tillich, I wonder if you would care to comment on the particular thinkers in the history of thought who have had the deepest influence upon your thinking through the years.
Now, this is a very large task you ask me. I could perhaps say that very early I read and learned by heart a history of philosophy, and from the very beginning, the earliest Greek thinkers before Socrates, people like Heraclitus and Parmenides, influenced me fundamentally, and this influence never has ceased. For me, still, a man like Parmenides is more important than most modern philosophers. But then the influence came from German classical philosophy. I studied Kant and Fichte even before I came to the university because I loved it. And there I was introduced in what I called before the German classical idealist philosophy. And finally it led me to a man named Schelling, who was a predecessor of Hegel in the development, and who had, of all of them, the greatest influence on me. In modern times, I would say that Nietzsche was decisive for my later development, and then in the 20th century, Heidegger. Now, these are a few names. I could go on like this indefinitely.
Yeah.
Have you, you mentioned Schelling and you mentioned Heidegger. Do you consider yourself to be closely related to the movement that today is called existentialism?
Yes, that's certainly the case.
As Kierkegaard had a basic influence upon your thinking?
Yes. Kierkegaard, we discovered as students around 1904 and 5 and read him when his name was completely unknown in larger groups, and I don't think known at all in this country. In any case, at that time his influence started, but he was not decisive. Decisive for me was the development of Schelling, which I would call in philosophical jargon in development from essentialism, which is very similar to what I called idealism before, to existentialism in the latest period of his life. And I am still often surprised to what a degree this man has anticipated most of the concepts of present-day existentialism as it is developed by Heidegger and Sartre and Marcel and Jaspers and many others. So I was introduced in a period in which the word existentialism didn't yet exist into existentialist thinking by the later period of Schelling. But I have in the meantime discovered something else which I must tell you. When I am asked which was your first and greatest influence in terms of existentialism, I would say my reading and learning by heart of Hamlet, of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where you have quite a lot of existentialist formulations about the human predicament. And as a young man, I was perhaps 17 years old at that time, I took them into myself as nothing else at that time. And so I was well prepared when Schelling came.
Would you be able to give us a definition of existentialism, Dr. Tillich?
Oh, I would say it is that philosophy which doesn't deal so much with the general nature of man and of his world, but which deals much more with the human predicament, with the way in which man is born and has to die, in which he is in anxiety, in which he is in the feeling of guilt, and often in our time this deep feeling of emptiness, of meaninglessness of life. All this belongs to the description of the human predicament as the existentialists give it, and not even most important, the philosophical existentialists, but I would say even more important, the novelists and the playwrights and the poets and the modern artists, the painters and sculptors and so on.
Yeah. How far would you say that the existentialism that we see in these various forms today in our society have Christian roots or background?
I think that everything which happened since the Western world has been brought into the Christian camp, that everything has consciously or unconsciously Christian influence. And this doesn't depend whether they call themselves Christian or anti-Christians. A man like Nietzsche, for instance, calls himself anti-Christian. But he is the son of a Christian minister. He was the son of a Christian minister. And in one moment he acknowledges this. He says about the preachers and priests whom he attacks all the time in the most aggressive way, they have blood of my own blood. He knew that in him there was the Christian blood, although it turned against Christianity.
Would you say the same thing is true of Sartre?
I think Sartre is farther away from Christianity than Nietzsche is, because he has a long tradition of French humanism. And French humanism is the attempt for centuries of developing a doctrine of man in which as many Christian elements as possible are excluded. So I would say even this is still Christian humanism, but it is much freer from visible influences of Christianity than in Nietzsche.
I take it you would not agree, Dr. Tillich, with those who take the position that some form of existentialist thinking might somehow become Christian or be related to Christianity, whereas what you have called the idealist or essentialist tradition somehow is hostile to Christianity.
I would say every tradition can be used, but I would say that in our period of history, it was a tremendous luck that existentialism came into reality, because the existentialist description of the human predicament, finitude, having to die, disease, guilt, despair, all these concepts are also in the description of man without God in the Christian tradition. So I would say we should use existentialist knowledge in order to describe the human situation without God.
Do you think Christianity is at a disadvantage, Dr. Tillich, when it aligns itself with a past philosophy so that this sort of thing is not possible?
I don't know whether I fully understood your question.
You're saying that existentialism is quite valuable to the interpretation of Christianity today.
Yes, very much.
Now, many
so.
theologians tend to align themselves with past theological traditions and think only in terms of the Platonic tradition or some other past tradition.
Oh, I wouldn't mind that. I don't think that Christianity is bound to any special tradition. It can use all of them, and it must transform all of them. It cannot identify itself with any of them.
In your early writings, you referred to yourself as a boundary thinker. And I remember reading one early autobiographical piece where you said a great deal about this and felt that somehow the word boundary described the type of thinking that you represented. I wonder if you could explain what you meant by this and whether you still feel this way.
Now, this is partly very autobiographical. It says that in my whole development, I was sometimes a professor of philosophy, sometimes a professor of theology, and even sometimes a professor of social education. Now this means I do not belong to one of these realms unambiguously. And when I, for instance, came to Frankfurt am Main, where I was professor of philosophy, I became more theological. When I came to Union Theological Seminary, where I was a theologian, then I became more philosophical in order to keep these two sides always together and not be in one line alone. I really believe that today the main problem is how can we relate philosophy, which I consider to be the universal consideration of world and man, with theology, which is the explanation of the Christian message as such. And so the boundary line is the boundary line between a universal understanding of the human situation and the special Christian message.
Are there other ways, Dr. Tillich, in which you would describe yourself as a boundary theologian or a boundary type thinker?
I would say boundary type man, not only theologian, not only thinker. For instance, in a autobiographical sketch which will be printed in paperback very soon. There I speak of the boundary line of land and ocean. I prefer to stay at the boundary line of land and ocean. And my old age home is therefore in a resort place, East Hampton, or the boundary line between country and city. I am very much fascinated by the city, cannot live without it, but after a certain time I must be in the country. Or the boundary line between the scientific and the poetic. I try to make each of my sermons not only into a speech about the subject, but about a kind of rhythmic expression of life in a more poetic sense. Or the boundary line between theology and philosophy, which we already have discussed. Or the boundary line between religion and culture generally, or if you want the other formula, between church and world. All these boundary lines are the place where I feel at home, and therefore perhaps I was able to spend my emigration and to go from Europe to America and then sometimes back to Europe and back to America, being even in this respect on the boundary line. And I believe that the favored place for understanding is a boundary line, but of course you have to pay the price. The favored place for living is in the middle of the country, but there I never could stay for a long time.
Dr. Tillich, through the years you have written a great deal and spoken a great deal about philosophy of life or a philosophy of life. What do you conceive to be the place of religion in a philosophy of life? Do you feel that religion is necessary to such a philosophy?
Yes, I certainly feel so, but everything depends what you mean with the word religion. My most favored description of what religion is that it's the answer to the question, what is the meaning of my life? For what do I live? Why have I come into this existence? Where do I go? What's my relation to the short time in which I live, and perhaps to an eternity which is above past and future? Now, all these are questions which every human being has somewhere in a corner of his soul, and nobody can really escape these questions. And what religion does is to try to answer these questions, and above all, the main question, what is the meaning of my life and life generally?
Do you feel that values, moral values, are intrinsically necessary to such a philosophy of life?
Yes, I think that life in a special dimension, I call it the dimension of spirit, which we have only in human beings in the world as far as we know it now. Maybe that there are other beings who also have this character which I call spirit. Now, wherever this spirit works and moves, there the basic foundation, the foundation of everything else, is morality. But again, I must say this has only sense if I say what I mean with morality. I mean with it all those activities of man, internal and external acts, in which he actualizes himself as a person, in which he becomes what he by nature is and should be, namely a person. So morality is not what many people think, a obedience to tables of laws, to all kinds of prescriptions which God, man, or society may give us. But morality is the realization of oneself as a person, and every act in which we do this is a moral act.
Then, Dr. Tillich, when you have spoken about the misunderstanding which is represented in what you have called moralism that many people have about the Christian faith, you're not rejecting morality, but something else.
Yes, now, the distinction between moralism and morality is that morality is the right thing, and moralism is its distortion, it's the wrong thing. Moralism is an attitude in which, as I just said, we follow external laws, like the laws of the state or the law of the Ten Commandments, or even the law of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, simply as laws instead of considering them as expressions of what we human beings essentially are and therefore should be. They are nothing which is strange to us, which is imposed to us from outside, but it's we ourselves put against ourselves. That's what I call a moral law. And now a moralist is a man who doesn't see this, who simply considers the moral laws as something which comes from outside, and where he tries to be as correct as possible, following what he considers to be the commandments of God, or the commandments of the church, or the commandments which is now probably the most important way, namely of society, especially of his own suburban society, with all its conventions. Now that's what I would call moralism. And that's just the opposite of morality, because morality is the free realization of a person as a person, and not the subjection to strange laws.
Could I ask you one more thing about that area of problems or questions? If we say that we will not follow moralism, then very often we find people reacting. I think some of us find this in our students in classes reacting this way. We often get the reaction, then what guides have we for making particular decisions in this very complicated kind of world in which we live? If we can't follow the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule and moral principles of this kind, what do we follow when we're making these decisions?
Now, this demands a long answer. And I will give you this answer as short as I can. The first principle of all moral action is love, but not love in the sense in which it's often used today, the sentimental form of love, which has nothing to do with morality, which is simply an emotion. But morality as but love as the reunion with, as I call it so, what is separated. Now in this case, what is separated are the other human beings, and also nature as a whole. And love is the power which reunites us with other human beings and with nature, and even with ourselves, and certainly with the ground of our being, the divine ground of our being. So love is the universal reuniting power. And everything is good which comes out of this reuniting power of love, and nothing is good, even it's the strictest obedience to a moral law, which does not come out of this power of love. Now, love has a character which nothing else has, namely it listens to the concrete situation here and now. I have to make decisions, moral decisions, each time, not only according to the principle of love, but also to the very concrete situation. When I am here in this moment talking with you, there must be some kind of love between us, but this kind is changed by the concrete situation. And an hour later, when I am, let's say, in my family or in the hospital or somewhere else, then my love principle would be applied in a different way because the situation demands something else. Now, between love and the concrete situation, the movement goes. But now you probably will ask me one more question. What then about the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule and the Sermon on the Mount and all this? They are rules of wisdom. They are based on human experience and put together in these short, all-embracing principles. And we must use them not as commandments which we have to obey, but as advices born out of the wisdom of mankind. And so we have actually three elements in every moral decision. And if you look at your own moral acts, you will find that this is a quite exact description. Ultimately, the principle of love. Without love, no moral act at all. Because love also includes justice. Justice is the backbone of love. Without justice, love is sentimental. Then second, the wisdom of the great lawgivers, as Moses, as Jesus, as the Golden Rule. And then finally, the very special situation here and now, which each time demands a decision. Now, out of these three elements, a moral decision would come.
Dr. Tillich, you have been dealing here with the very heart of the Christian religion or the Christian faith. I wonder if, in light of what you have just said, you would care to say what the place of the Christ is in this, the relationship of the Christ to the moral life, to moral commandments.
Yes, now this is, their double answer can be given. The first is very obvious. The manifestation of the principle of love in a unique and incomparable way is the cross of Jesus, who is called the Christ. And there we have a life which is in every moment determined by God and therefore by love, and which never has a conflict between himself and God, himself and love. So I would say the first is the manifestation of the principle of love in a personal life, in a real personal life. Then the second is something else. And this brings me back to your question on moralism. We didn't discuss before what is the motivation of the moral act. How are we able to act morally at all? We certainly are not able simply by trying to obey the moral law. The more seriously we take this, the more the despair is into which we fall. People like Paul and Augustine and Luther and Calvin are great examples of this. So there must be another power which makes us love in the right way, in the concrete situation. And this power I would call the power of grace or of reconciliation. And this power is manifest also in the picture of Jesus as a Christ in the New Testament. So he reveals both the principle of love and the way in which love can be actualized.
Would you say that this makes the church necessary to this kind of morality or moral living?
The church, you ask?
Yes, is Christ known other than through the church?
No. The church is for me the living tradition of these principles which I just have developed, and only within the church there is the possibility of receiving this power directly. But I must here make a qualification. If you say the church, then this sounds very much as the churches as we see them today in this country and in the Western world, where we have Christian churches, and a few Christian churches also in other continents. Now, of course, in these churches, the church is present. But the church is not only present in the so-called Christian churches. It's present wherever the Spirit, the divine Spirit, grasps the human spirit. And this happens not only in the churches, it happens also outside these churches, which sometimes I have called for this reason the latent churches, in opposition to the manifest church. So my concept of church is much larger than the churches which you can see at the crossroads or at Middletown or somewhere. I think of the present, of the, I call it the spiritual community, which is present not only in all these churches, but also far beyond them in so-called secular groups of all kinds, in other religions, in Judaism, and so on. So if I answered your question with yes, then I must now qualify my yes by the distinction of the manifest and the latent church.
Are you saying now that the manifest church is the institutional church, as we know it in history? The latent church is the church which is other than or outside of the institutional church. And if this is what you're saying, are you in reality saying that Christ is available to morality outside of the institutional church?
Yes. Now, first a little qualification to this word. When I hear the word institutional church, I think not only of the minister and the elders and the church building and the services and all this, but I also think at the personal life of the members of these churches, their personal religion, their encounter with God. This is one thing. Then the other thing is what I call the latent church. There also we have groups which are organized more or less. I think of some political groups, some youth movements, from some social groups, all kinds of communities which are driven by something which belongs to the principle of love. And there is also the individuals in it who have their personal life. And I must tell you, in my whole life, I have met so many people of whom I had the feeling that the love of Christ was driving them without their knowing that it has anything to do with Christ. And if I was asked by students of theology how I could say such a thing, I simply say because Jesus said it. Namely in Matthew 24, he praises those who work love without even knowing his name.
Dr. Tillich, you were speaking of the love of Christ, which is at the center of the Christian faith. You were speaking of this in relation to morality a little while ago. This suggested another question to me, which has some relation to what you've just been saying also, I think. Let me describe very briefly the situation out of which the question comes. About 4 years ago or so, I was involved in a conference of an international character of representatives of student Christian movements around the world. And one speaker who was invited to speak to this group was a French existentialist, a follower of Jean-Paul Sartre. The theme of the conference was Jesus Christ the Reconciler. I assume that when we speak of the love of Christ, we mean also a power to reconcile people and heal their separations and divisions. But the existentialist said, he not being a Christian, that for him, Christ was not an answer here, but part of the problem. That what kept him apart from other people was more than anything else this business of Jesus Christ being taken as an absolute, which he could not accept. And therefore, to him, this was not an answer at all. What would you say in response?
I would agree with him, as the situation is, not as the situation should be. The situation is now so, for innumerable people inside and outside the churches, that the answer, Jesus Christ, as it's usually said, is entirely ununderstandable. And one of the reasons for this is a very seemingly unimportant thing, but actually very important, namely that the word Jesus Christ is not a name like Paul Tillich, but that Jesus Christ means the man Jesus who has the function to be the Christ. And Christ means the bringer of a new eon, as it was called, a new reality, a new being, as I like to call it, a new power of love, or however you want to call it. And if you say Jesus, who is the bringer of a new eon, a new period of history, then of course the whole situation changes. Then at least the question becomes meaningful. Can we say this? And what does that mean? So I am very much in sympathy with this existentialist. If the acceptance of Jesus as a Christ is a doctrinal law imposed on people who don't even know what the word means, then I would say we have to rebel against it. And my whole theological work is an attempt to interpret the meaning of this statement that Jesus is the Christ.
Some years ago, Dr. Tillich, referring to the present situation of the church, you wrote a book, or a collection of essays were published under the title The Protestant Era. And I think you made the statement at that time that you had suggested the title The End of the Protestant Era. I wonder if you would tell us what you intended in this title.
Yes, I wrote a paper, and it was printed as an article under the title The End of the Protestant Era. And then with a question mark, The End of the Protestant Era, question mark. And then a collection of many of my articles was made, and we discussed the problem of the title. And I said, now, they all deal with Protestantism in some way, why don't we call it The End of the Protestant Era, question mark? The publisher said, it's the rules of publishing to have a question mark in the title. So we make it without a question mark, The End of the Protestant Era. Then other friends of mine came, theological professors, Protestants, and said, don't say this, and the Catholics will say that I have said Protestantism has come to an end, which I didn't mean either. And so I was between these two alternatives, and then I think we called it simply Protestantism, or the Protestant principle. And but the article, The End of the Protestant Era, question mark, was still in the book as one article. And there you can see what I mean with it, namely the question, can we have this kind of free, autonomous, as I call it, self-deciding, self-determining kind of religion which Protestantism is, which is always able to criticize all authorities, and which is always able to unite faith and doubt. Can we keep that up? Or has the time come where people are so tired of making decisions of their own that they prefer to go under authorities, religious or quasi-religious political authorities?
It has been several years now since you wrote this essay. What do you feel about the present situation? Do you feel that we're in a position now where people can accept this kind of responsibility, or willing to, or
no? Excuse me. I am afraid that it's almost the opposite. That we are now going in the same direction of conformism, which I was afraid of when I wrote this article. And this kind of conformity has also sociological reasons. For instance, the big corporations, the suburban kind of life, in which any individual non-conformism is much more difficult than it was in the big cities or in a period of the individual businessmen. We have now a sociological structure which almost drives us towards conformity. And I don't know what will become of Protestantism if conformism is completely victorious. So the problem is as serious today as it was 10 years ago, and perhaps even more serious.
Perhaps we're even beyond the Protestant era at the present time, if the other was the end.
We might be a little bit beyond it already, and the question is, what can we do with Christianity if the Protestant principle must go underground, as it perhaps must very soon?
We were talking, Dr. Tillich, about the fact, rather you mentioned the fact just a few moments ago, that the name Jesus Christ has no meaning for a lot of people in today's world. You have dealt a great deal also with the general problem of the symbols and language associated with our religious tradition, and the problem that is raised for us in this respect today. Would you make some comment about that?
Yes, now I would say that we have learned now in the last 10 years, I think very generally, that religious language is symbolic language. That means that you cannot take any religious symbol literally. If you do so, you bring it down to a level to which it doesn't belong, to a level of the table or of our talks with each other, but religion belongs to the level of the infinite, the ultimate, the unconditional. And if we speak about it, we must use ordinary words and objects. But if we do so, we must at the same time know that we now use them not in their ordinary meaning, but in another meaning. And this meaning I call symbolic. And symbolic is not something less than literal, but it's something more. It is a power in itself. A great symbol cannot be created at will. It grows and it may die, but it's not at our disposal as signs are. And so when somebody says only a symbol, I get angry and tell my students never say only a symbol, even if I myself slip with my tongue sometimes. But say just a symbol, that's the right thing here and nothing else.
You are assuming that words are symbols as well as such things as the Star of David and the cross.
Exactly. Words can be symbols, historical figures can be symbols, art has symbols, and the last one, religion, has symbols.
Dr. Tillich, you're one of the few theologians, at least in the United States, who's interested in psychotherapy too. What prompts this interest in psychotherapy?
Now, I would qualify your question from the very beginning. This was so perhaps 25 years ago or 26 when I came to this country. But now there is a very large interest in many colleges and universities of the relationship, and even in the churches themselves, of the relationship in religion and psychotherapy. Now, my own background in this respect lies in Europe, and started on 2 points. First, when after the First World War, I met the writings of Freud and people who were extremely influenced by him. And I was fascinated by the fact that we here have a scientifically verifiable way of going into the unconscious elements of human nature. Now, as you know, the word unconscious is not invented by Freud. It was a philosophical concept which played a great role for hundreds of years. But Freud made a really empirical scientific approach to it. And this, of course, was very fascinating. It showed me, first of all, that there are in every human being unconscious drives which he doesn't know, but which determine him. And this had many consequences for theological thinking, to which I may return later. But in the present moment, I want to add another source. It was the existentialist philosophy, especially of Heidegger, where very similar problems were discussed. The problem of the hidden anxiety in every human being, the problem of guilt feeling, the problem of death anticipation, all these problems which in this philosophy were discussed philosophically, were discussed in Freudian psychotherapy medically, so to speak. So it was here for me a kind of reunion between the medical, the philosophical, and the theological work. That made it so fascinating for me.
In your work, you've talked a lot about anxiety, and of course Freud does too. Do you mean the same thing as Freud does by anxiety?
Yes, now there we come to a very concrete problem where my agreement and disagreement with Freud comes out immediately. I believe that Freud's concept of anxiety is so conceived that the anxiety, so to speak, can be removed, at least in some of the Freudians is the idea, that the anxiety is a pathological factor, that it is a kind of disease, and therefore that a good psychoanalysis can remove anxiety. Now, I believe that anxiety is a fundamental character of the human situation, and there I agree, of course, with the, let's say, Old and New Testament. In the world you have anxiety, don't be anxious, all these words. In Augustine, who speaks very much about the human anxiety, and I find it in philosophers like Heidegger, who makes it one of his central subjects in the analysis of the human predicament. Now, we all believe that anxiety is something which has to do with man's finitude and man's guilt, while the Freudian school takes it simply as a neurotic phenomenon and believe that a good analysis can remove it, or sometimes even that a good steak can remove it, as I heard somebody say, who who said to somebody who complained about his anxieties, please eat a good steak and then you will become all right. I don't believe that's possible. I believe that special anxiety can be overcome like this, that man's restlessness of the heart never can be overcome by any psychotherapy.
I wonder if you and Freud are talking about two levels of anxiety. Is his at the same level of anxiety as the anxiety you know?
No, I believe that his anxiety is much more the neurotic anxiety, and I would call it ontological anxiety, but this word is difficult, so I may call it the anxiety which belongs to man's finite nature and is not neurotic but is natural in the way in which man lives and is construed.
Would it be possible to make this distinction, Dr. Tillich, by saying that there is such a thing as natural and healthy anxiety and such a thing as unhealthy anxiety?
Yes, no, but this is difficult. But we can say that the natural anxiety of having to die is universal. Every human being has a horror when he thinks of, as I just worked today in preparing a sermon, when he is forgotten forever, when he sinks into absolute being forgottenness. And this is what I really believe is in every human being. Somebody a few days ago said to me, "Oh no, the only anxiety is the fear about the disagreeable process of dying." But I never was afraid of dying. But I always had the fundamental anxiety of non-being, of being no longer, of being forgotten in eternity. Now that's what I believe is the real anxiety and the fundamental anxiety. And I don't know to which degree Freud really means this. I know that many of his pupils interpret him in such a way that he considers anxiety as a more or less neurotic factor which can be healed by psychoanalysis.
Is the anxiety of which you are speaking then is a part of all human experience?
Yes,
every person has it.
Of course.
Yes.
Dr. Tillich, when the psychiatrist so-called heals a man of his neurosis, could this be a very dangerous thing because it isn't going into the depths as you are speaking?
Now you bring me back to my lecture which I gave in your institute about the meaning of health. And in this lecture I said it is possible to heal in the one dimension and do damage in another dimension. And this very often happens. It's quite possible that the surgeon heals in the dimension of the merely bone structure side of the human being or the biological side of the human being, but by doing so he may hurt the psychological side of man's being, which I call the side of self-awareness. Or it may be that the psychologist heals in his dimension, and that in the dimension of what I called the spirit of man, that there perhaps something happens which I could call a feeling of emptiness or a feeling of arbitrariness, that he does now what he wants to do and has no moral principles any longer. Now if this happens, then I would speak of unhealthy health, of a health which is not healthy, although seemingly somebody is healed, but his total personality is more damaged than healed. Now that's what you probably meant with your question.
It sounds, Dr. Tillich, as though when you approach it from this side, it might be necessary for the doctor, that is the physician, the MD, to have psychiatric training, and for the psychotherapist or psychoanalyst to have medical training.
Now, this can be this way, but first of all, I think the psychoanalysts, and they acknowledge that, they all need a psychoanalytic treatment, because without that they wouldn't even have the experience of the position in which their patients are. But beyond this, I think they also need it for themselves. Every human being has a lot of unconscious elements which he doesn't recognize, and which nevertheless have a tremendous influence on his actions. And in this respect, the analyst and the patients are sitting in the same boat. They both need analysis. And of course, the medical people need medical healing and psychological healing also. Now, healing does not always go through doctors. Sometimes it goes to friends, sometimes through wives and husbands, sometimes to children. And then ultimately everybody needs a healing in the, let me call it so, ultimate dimension, in the dimension of the eternal or ultimate concern of man about his eternity. And in this dimension, of course, every human being is in the predicament of being estranged from himself and his world and his God and his other men, and needs reunion. Therefore, I spoke in another context about the principle of love as a really healing power in the ultimate dimension. Now, all these dimensions need healing, and in all of these dimensions, there is conflict, there is tension, there is estrangement, there are different forces fighting with each other, and therefore reunion is needed. And may I add here a remark about the term. When religion speaks of salvation, then usually people have forgotten what the word salvation means. Salvation comes from the Latin word salvus, which means heal and whole. He who is healed is salvus. Salvation, therefore, means making heal and whole. And here the religious and the medical words are identical. What the doctors do and what the ministers try to do, both is healing, only in another dimension. The doctors either in the bodily dimension or in the psychological dimension, or there is also healing in the sociological dimension, and the great statesmen try to do that. And there's finally healing, which is called salvation, in the religious dimension. But this salvation is healing, and that shouldn't be forgotten in our teaching and preaching.
You have invited a question here which perhaps you would rather not have, but you have asked for it. What is the relationship between this type of healing, reunion, of which you are speaking, and the movement which today is so popular in this country called faith healing, where television is being exploited for purposes of faith healing and where faith healing is popular among a great many people? Are you speaking of the same thing?
No, I speak of the opposite thing. I hate the word faith healing, and I have questions about the praxis of it. It should be called what it really is, namely magic healing. Healing by magic concentration. I can do that with myself. Sometimes by magic concentration I heal myself from not too serious things, but from things where concentration is sufficient. Other people can do that with me, and I can do it with other people. All this is healing to concentration on something. It has nothing to do with religion and nothing to do with God, even if God is the point of concentration. But then God becomes a magic power and nothing else. Faith is something absolutely different. Faith is the state of being grasped by that which concerns us ultimately. And in this state, we may become a whole person.
Dr. Tillich, you mentioned faith here. Is faith in the Christian sense just the same as a patient's faith in his psychiatrist, which is called transference or is a part of transference? Are we talking about the same thing there?
No, we don't talk at all. The one is confidence. Confidence in my doctor. You know, I was a few days in the hospital, and I had a tremendous confidence in my doctors here in the Pittsburgh hospital. But I had not religious faith with respect to them. They were not my ultimate concern. They were a very serious preliminary concern. But they were not my ultimate concern. And my ultimate concern is the object of faith. And this has is neither identical with confidence, nor is it identical with belief. And perhaps I should say a few words about this. because it's so often confused with belief. Faith is not belief in something unbelievable, as usually it is defined, but faith is being grasped by an ultimate concern, being in the grip of something which is of infinite seriousness for me, of seriousness which trespasses life and death. That's what faith is.
Dr. Tillich, you've mentioned ultimate concern and seriousness. Today, there seems to be a great deal of increase in mental ill health. Is there any relationship between this and a lack of seriousness or a lack of depth or meaning of life?
Yes, I would say that it is the lack of the meaning of life is perhaps the best answer. In an article which appeared 2 years ago in the Saturday Evening Post, I called it the loss of the depth dimension, the loss of the dimension of depth. I also can call it the loss of the meaning of life. It's the same. I meant exactly the same thing. And I believe, but let me express this in a little bit different way. The whole human life is always determined by two lines, a horizontal line and a vertical line. The horizontal line is our going ahead, our acting, our following purposes, our pursuit of happiness, as the Constitution of the of America says. This is the horizontal line, and this horizontal line is so important for this country because it started with the horizontal line by going away from old Europe, by conquering this continent step by step, going ahead, and now going ahead again in all directions, even to the moon and to the stars. This is all horizontal. And then there is another line. This is the vertical line. And the vertical line is experienced here and now in this moment, where I ask the question, for what do I live? Is this enough always to run ahead? And then everybody's conscience tells him that's not enough. More is needed. The dimension of the eternal must cut into this horizontal. We must have a vertical line also. And now I would say, if this vertical line, this cutting in of the dimension of the eternal is completely lost, no, completely is it never lost, but is largely lost, let's say, then the healing power of a life which is concentrated in the eternal is lost, and the many illnesses of a mental character occur. And I think the empirical statistics show that it's mostly something which has to do with a meaningless life. It's not so much with guilt feeling, although that's also there. It's not so much with anxiety about fate and vicissitudes of life, but it's the feeling for what am I here and the inability to find an answer.
I wonder if I might ask you, Dr. Tillich, perhaps in the name of some of our viewers, you have spoken of faith as being grasped, and you have spoken also of the great need for this vertical dimension in our present culture and in our present world. I think it's quite possible that some of our viewers at this point might ask you the question, what do you do in order to have faith or to be grasped?
Yes. Now, I am astonished at this question, which was the only question which I heard when I came to this country 26 years ago and spoke about anything whatsoever between heaven and earth, or to heaven and hell, if you want to say. Whatever it was, the question was, now what have we to do? This has very much changed, and I feel that this means the climate in this country has very much changed. The feeling that mere activism is not enough has taken place very much in the younger generation. This is good and bad at the same time, but it's a fact, which I, as somebody who came from outside, could easier observe than somebody who lives here. And I observed that very clearly. Now, if I am asked you a question, then I answer, of course, you cannot make that you are grasped. That would be a contradiction in terms. If you are grasped, you are grasped. The only thing one can do is to keep open one's questioning, to keep open one's desire for a meaning of life, to be a serious doubter, but a serious one, not a cynical one. And I believe that it's very important that we make this distinction. I believe that cynical doubt is a very dangerous thing, because it makes out of cynicism a new religion, a new ultimate. I know cynical students of this kind. But if the doubt and the question for the meaning of life is serious and without an answer, that's perhaps the best condition for being grasped, because the answer comes to those who are not on the highest level, but on the lowest level, if the one condition is fulfilled, that the lowest level is serious, and it's not simply indifference. I tell you, in all my life, what I ever hated was not atheism or doubt or anything like this, not even cynicism, but indifference. Indifference, having a good time, and this is all what life means, is for me the worst sin against the spirit.
Well, there's some sense in which you are saying here that doubt is something positive in human life, and perhaps you're even saying that doubt is a part of faith and necessary to faith. Generally, in the American scene, we don't think this way. Are you actually insisting that doubt has its positive value and is to be desired?
Yes, now I would say that there are two kinds of doubt. The one is the scientific doubt. Now everybody would say scientific doubt is the presupposition of every scientific work. That's obvious. You must doubt about your results to the last moment, and even if you accepted them, you must know they may be changed in a short time even, or in a late time, but they will be changed. Then there is what I call existential doubt, the doubt which concerns our whole existence, the doubt about the meaning of life. And here I would say, in every act of faith, there is an element of doubt which is conquered, but which is not removed. Conquering something does not mean removing it. It means taking it into. And so I like to say, faith embraces itself and the doubt about itself. Faith is the more embracing reality, but a faith without doubt would either be subjection to a strange authority, or it would be scientific evidence. And in matters of the meaning of our life, we cannot have the one or the other. We can have authority, but we cannot have evidence. But if we have authority, then we suppress some doubt. And therefore I have made the observation that those religious attitudes in which doubt is repressed are those which become fanatical. You must be aware that your faith has in itself an element of risk, a daring element, which may be mistaken. But if you are so secure in your faith, then you cannot stand that anybody comes and doubts about it from outside. And then you turn against him. You get angry because you don't feel safe yourself about it. You have repressed something. And that which you have repressed works now in terms of making you fanatical. And therefore I say, faith embraces itself and the doubt of itself.
Dr. Tillich, you are one of the few writers in the American culture writing from the point of view of religion or theology who have dealt seriously with the problem of doubt and attempted to deal with it in some kind of positive or constructive way. There are many parents who have a genuine problem here because they've been led to believe that the phenomenon of doubt in their children is a bad thing. The church sometimes has dealt with it as a bad thing. I wonder if you could give us some guidance on how to deal with doubt in young people and children.
Now, first of all, I am very glad that you refer to children, because there the problem, I think, is most acute and direct. My own experience has led me to the following, let's call it a scheme of 3 steps with respect to the religious education of children. The first is that you give them some of the most impressive and powerful symbols of the religious tradition. I speak now of all religions and denominations. Because if you don't do this, then the earliest impressions of children are prone to be something which is not the ultimate. But in the symbols, although the children understand them only in a very limited way, something ultimate is implied. When we speak of Christ or the Holy Virgin or God and his actions or the creation or the fall or all these great religious symbols which appear in Christianity, then the children don't understand them, but they have some kind of receptivity for them which has influence on their whole life. Then a second period comes, and this is the critical period when out of the surroundings or out of their own thinking, the doubt about the validity of these symbols arises. This is a necessary period. Without it, no human being ever would become a fully developed, mature personality. There must be in the development of children a moment in which the question of truth is asked. And then the moment comes in which parents or teachers or ministers must deal with children in a quite different way. Then they must try to interpret these symbols, to give their meaning, to show that they are not fairy tales, but that they are not events either which you can describe as you can describe a battle of the past or a person of the past, but that they are expressions of man's relationship to what is infinitely serious. And this is the period where often the parents and equally often the teachers simply fail. They are not able to do this with that wisdom which is necessary. I have heard of Sunday school teachers who, if a child raises his or her finger and asks such a question, he or she is scolded and asked to keep silent. Now I would say in this moment, if by chance I came into this class, I would dismiss this teacher the same day, the same hour. She wouldn't even have the possibility to continue this 1 hour, so angry I would become. She has then to explain and has not to dictate and to say you must believe that. I think this is one of the greatest evils in the great churches of today, that they don't take the question of the children seriously. I take them so seriously that even when I come to my most difficult philosophical problems, I often quote children's questions, because the children know more about the immediate problems than the spoiled philosophers in many cases. And then, if this is done successfully, then we come to the third step, in which we can again speak and live in the great classical symbols, but we can live in them now knowing that they are symbols, that the problem is not whether this or this has happened, whether God exists or does not exist, but the problem is what does all this mean for the meaning of my life. Now this is a schematic process of religious education, but this gives me also the key for the meaning of faith in mature people, because in mature people the same stages always reappear. There's always moments in which one is inclined to accept everything in a kind of superstitious subjection to authorities. Then there are moments in which one is inclined to doubt of everything. And these moments are then when maturity speaks to us as an ideal. And then the third stage, in which faith is there. We are grasped by it, but it is not belief in something or something not, but it is a surrender of the whole personality to the meaning of life, which is expressed in the symbols we have now understood in these three stages.
You speak of this second stage, the critical stage. I think perhaps that you would say that when young people are dealt with wrongly in this second stage, this produces a kind of guilt in human life which is unhealthy. Now, one of the forms in which we encounter this at the present time in the American culture is in terms of the consciousness of status and all that goes along with this, and the great pressure for conformity in young people. Do you see a certain parallel here where young people begin to doubt the value of this status consciousness and try to break out of it? Should this perhaps be dealt with in the same way as religious doubt?
Yes, no, I wouldn't even question this. It seems to me absolutely clear. And I think even these two things often belong together. There are cultural situations where the conformity is at the same time a religious conformity. And therefore, religious doubt and doubt about the whole state of conformist society is one and the same doubt. And I, of course, would say that we have to deal with it in the same way. I would generally say a boy who never was a rebel against the conformity of parents, teachers, and the surrounding society never can become something important. He must have in a special period his doubt, and now some people say, all right, I will agree with you, in some period the child or the young man must have the period of rebellion, but after a certain time this should stop, and then he should become a good, lovable conformist. And I would say no. The greatest rebels were rebels their whole life. The Christians, the early Christians, the prophets, the reformers, the early Franciscans, and I can say many others who were great rebels when they were mature, because then the institutions in which they lived were understood by them in all their negativities, and they rebelled against them. So I would say criticism and doubt belong to the total development of a sound life, and I may add, I call this my Protestant principle.
I wouldn't want to ask you to play the role of a prophet, but do you think that it's possible, if the sociological analysis which is being given to us at the present is accurate, and the pressures toward conformity are as great as we are being told, do you think that it's possible that we may be creating some kind of national neurosis, or perhaps neurosis in the whole of Western culture with this?
I think your question is already an understatement. We have done this already, and I believe that the innumerable individual cases of neurotic behavior are expressions of this universal neurosis. And may I add here something? It is a very logical question you asked when you asked about the relation of conformity and neurosis. Because what is neurosis? Neurosis is the escape from facing reality as a whole. People are too weak to face reality as it really is. And so they withdraw. And they withdraw, as I like to say, to some place of safety, to some castle. This is a very good withdrawal, very useful for them for the moment. The whole of life doesn't bother them anymore, and they have their safety in a limited relationship to life. And now the neurotic action follows. They defend this limited place on which they are able to live against the whole of reality. We call that defense mechanism in psychoanalysis, or we call it compulsory self-restriction, or compulsory dependence on one element in oneself. Now, this then leads, if it is done by larger groups of the society, necessary to this limited way of looking at life, as for instance many suburban communities besides our big cities today do. You have a very definite form of life, definite form of thinking, and you can stand life on this basis. But if somebody comes, you call him a prophet, and tries to disrupt this conformity, then he, of course, is stoned as all prophets were, because he takes away their fundamental safety belt.
Dr. Tillich, there's an area in which you have done a lot of thinking and writing, which I would like to get in a question or two about at this point. That is the area of art. I'd like to ask you first, what was the basis of your original interest in this field?
I can tell you this exactly. It was in the trenches of the First World War, where I saw all the ugliness of the world in every respect. Humanly, the disrupted nature, the disrupted human relations. And in this, and physical ugliness unspeakable. And in this ugliness, there came through the field bookstores for the soldiers, the magazines, and often very good magazines with very good pictures. And I cut them out immediately, and we all did this, and hang them up in our little huts in the war. And then I bought more books about it and gained more and more interest. And then I did in the free times during the war what I did at the university with philosophy. I studied it systematically, namely the history of art very exactly, and the different styles and all this. And then another thing happened. This was, I came back then from the war in 1918, and there was a friend of mine, a very excellent and brilliant art critic, who introduced me into modern artistic styles. It was mostly at that time German Expressionism and French painting since Cézanne. And I didn't understand it, and he showed it to me. And I remember this afternoon, which had importance for my whole life, in which I suddenly, like a lightning, realized what beauty of visual arts is and what beauty modern art can express. And ever since, I was like a converted, not religiously converted, but artistically converted follower of modern art.
Do you, would you say that it is in such areas as this, in culture, in the arts, and perhaps in other phases of culture, that one can best begin his search for meaning, or perhaps to use your phrase, ultimate concern? I'm really asking you a personal question here. In the search for meaning and for ultimate concern, what seems to you to be most important in your own experience?
No, this is a big question and needs a big answer. And you want me to make a little speech?
Yes.
No, all right, then I will try to do this. Now, the question of importance has, of course, a very biographical aspect, an autobiographical aspect. When I look back at my own life, then I would say that perhaps the church services given by my father in a very old 14th century Gothic church in eastern Germany, beautiful old church, and all what belonged to this church services impressed me so that I felt there is something which I much later in theological terms called with other people the holy. And this discovering of the sphere of the holy in the church services of my father was at the same time the basis for my decision to become a theologian. I don't doubt about this. This seems to be autobiographically very correct. There was an other element involved in it, the great dramatic vision which I found in the Christian drama, in the drama of creation, fall, incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, and final judgment. Now this whole is of course a whole of symbols, but these symbols had very early a tremendous power about my imagination. And I believe that out of the dramatic character of this story of the world in religious terms, my own type of dramatic thinking in philosophy came. My interest in philosophy of history, in the drawing the universe into human history. And now the next step was probably the discovery of philosophy. It was also an autobiographical event. I was in the house of one of the ministers, of whom my father was, as was called at that time, the superintendent, a kind of suffragette bishop. And there I discovered a not very big volume of history of philosophy. And I studied that thoroughly when I was still in school, and knew all the philosophers from the first to the last by heart and with their doctrines when I went to the university. And now I was at the university student both of theology and philosophy. And of course I had to find a way in which one can be both. And my whole theological work, which started very early in my own study years. The first traces of what I would think later are so early that I said today to my friends with whom I talk here that I didn't learn anything in my whole life, because in my earliest writings I find everything already present. Now, of course, it's only partly present and potentially present, but somehow it's present. And if you ask me now about the further things, then one cultural realm after the other came into my interest. Of course, politics, when I was pushed into the First World War as a chaplain and came back, and there was the German Revolution, which I enjoyed because I felt that the old system was ripe to go down. And there I developed what we called at that time religious socialism. Then came the discovery of Freud. We have talked together about it too, and my interest in philosophy and culture. Then came the interest in art, about which we just have talked. And then came, of course, with my children, the interest in the problems of education. And so the whole cultural realm was for me not a realm besides religion, but I saw always in all of them the problem of the ultimate meaning of life. And now something else connected with this. When you ask me what is the most important thing, then I would say neither of these cultural things is the most important thing, because they all are transitory. Every political creation comes and goes after a certain time. Every philosophical creation comes and goes. Every artistic creation comes and goes. Every poetic creation comes and goes. Therefore, what is absolutely important, unconditionally important, cannot be something which comes and goes, but which remains in all of them and through all of them. And now please don't believe that I answer the question what is most important with the word religion. I don't do this. Because I know religion as a function of man's spirit, religion as I like to call it, the self-transcending desire of man's spirit, is in itself something which comes and goes. So what is left if even religion is not that which is ultimately important? It is that which transcends all of them, which is beyond all of them, which is beyond religion as well as beyond culture. And that is the ultimate itself and its manifestation wherever it manifests itself. And of course, there are its manifestations in the realm of the religious life. We call them usually revelatory experiences, as the prophets had them. There is the ultimate, in the same way, in the philosophical life. Many philosophers took the ultimate equally seriously as the theologians and as the religious people. It is in the artistic realm, and I know many artists who through their pictures want to communicate not only artistic symbols, but something ultimate. And so it's with all the other realms too. But it has always the character of in and through. Not religion, but something in and through religion. Not philosophy and the other cultural things, but in and through philosophy and the other cultural things. And this is what I call ultimate concern. Now this ultimate concern is the judging power for all the others. And it is the judging power because it has the character of eternity. And now if you ask me directly, what I take ultimately seriously, then I would say ultimately seriously I can take only the ultimate. And for the ultimate I also can say that which is without conditions, that which is infinite, that which is the eternal. So I can answer this question. Now if you ask me how came this really biographically to pass, then I could perhaps point to two moments. The one is the relation of being guilty, and the other is the relation of being finite. The relation of being guilty was experienced very strongly in early adolescence and childhood, and you can be guilty in an absolute sense only to that which is eternal. And the experience of being finite always occurred, especially in view of death. For instance, one night in the First World War, which I never can forget. But it appears again whenever death of others or the own death is near. And so I can perhaps conclude my answer to your question that there is only one thing which is ultimately seriously in life and death, and that is that which is eternal.